Greetings, everyone. I'm very delighted to meet you all. This is part of our series for Shuddhashar FreeVoice. It's our webinar series. My name is Lisa Knight. I am Professor of Anthropology and Religions of South Asia at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. I am also editor and co-director of Shuddhashar FreeVoice, a platform and magazine that is dedicated to social justice and human dignity and freedom of expression. Today's webinar builds on our most recent issue, Curated, which was published in February 2025. The title of the webinar is Queer Curation, Art, Film, and the Politics of Recognition. And this session will draw on the insights of two contributors from that issue, along with a third guest who brings additional perspectives to the conversation. So our discussion today will focus on the joys and challenges of curating queerness, building community, and navigating recognition and socio-political pressures in Sweden and in the US South. I'm incredibly honored today to welcome our three guests, and I will introduce them briefly, and then we will have our conversation. Shuddhashar is a filmmaker and a media scholar, currently living in East Germany. His book, Curating Precarity, Swedish Queer Film Festivals as Microactivism, was published by Uppsala University in 2021. He was also the recipient of the SYLFF postdoctorate fellowship which I think is also in Uppsala. Is that right? His first fiction short, It's Not Working, has been selected at several short film festivals around the world. He has most recently been commissioned by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation to produce a documentary on the lives of South Asian food delivery workers in Berlin, which to me sounds like an exquisitely delicious project. So good luck on that. I'm sure you're going to enjoy, and I can't wait to see the results. Kylie Fisher is Assistant Professor of Art History and an affiliate faculty member in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. She earned her PhD in art history through the joint doctoral program at Case Western Reserve University and the Cleveland Museum of Art. Kylie has published and presented her research on early modern European prints and drawings, and AAPI plus stories and experiences in South Carolina throughout the US and abroad. Most recently, Kylie and her student Alex co-curated the multi-artist exhibition Found Family, Queerness and Community in the South at Furman University's Thompson Art Gallery. Alexandra Aradas is a junior at Furman University, double majoring in studio art and politics and international affairs. They are actively involved in various campus organizations, including serving as a Hearst Fellow, a member of the Riley Institute Advanced Team, Vice President of the Roers Art Club, orientation staff, and Dins Vote, among many others. In 2024, they were the Queer Arts of Greenville Research Fellow, working alongside Professor Kylie Fisher. As part of that fellowship, Aradas co-curated Found Family, Queerness and Community in the South, an exhibition at the Furman Thompson Art Gallery. Additionally, in 2024, they co-founded the Queer Arts Database with the Queer Arts Initiative. They is an alum also of the South Carolina Governor's School for the Arts and Humanities, where they studied creative writing. And in 2021, they were honored as the Rock Hill Youth Poet Laureate, becoming the first to hold this title in South Carolina. They had the privilege of opening for the Poetry Slam champion, Rachel McKibbens, at the One Word Poetry Festival. Their work has been published in anthologies and literary journals, earning awards from Scholastic and other organizations. So wonderful. It's nice to have you all three here. Delighted to have this opportunity to talk about your work and your various interests and areas, and to really get into the subject that we're discussing today. And I wonder if we could just start a little bit. I know everybody wants to hear a little bit more about your backgrounds as well, but maybe you could start by telling us something about how you approach the subject of queer art, and what drives you to do the work that you do. And who would like to start?
I'll jump in if you don't mind. First of all, thank you so much to Lisa for organizing this great panel. I'm excited to talk with all of you. So I'll do my best to be brief. But as Lisa's introduction indicated, I am an art historian. So art is what I do, what I explore. And my goals with that is to really showcase how art becomes this tangible manifestation of human imagination, thought, and memory. And so when you qualify it with queer, it just adds, I think, a different dimension of thinking about kind of this multiplicity of human experience, which is really exciting. But to begin, I think it's important for us to talk about how we would define queer art. That's something I'm always thinking about. So for me, it's kind of a three-pronged approach. Queer art is art by artists that identify as part of the queer community. It's also art of queer subjects, narratives, and histories. And then thirdly, I think I use queer as a kind of methodological lens. So I look at artistic representations, subjects that challenge and disrupt this kind of cis heteronormative values and ideas and thoughts. So I look at it in that way.
Okay, I can probably jump in now. Thank you, Lisa, again for organizing this and giving me the opportunity to contribute to the magazine. It's great for me to also be able to use this as a way to put out my work to a broader audience, and I think that's wonderful. My entry into this is uh, through 3 points, 3 vantage points. One is the vantage point of cinema, of course, which, as a filmmaker, I'm kind of obsessed with films and everything to do around with films. So even when I decided to take a break from my filmmaking and do a PhD, it had to be on cinema, in one way or the other. The second vantage point is obviously the point of sexuality, and the third is theory. And for me, like, this is an opportunity to see how these three sort of realms come together for me. uh, Queer for me is, in that sense, in the context of this research, it's not a very strong sort of radical conceptual tool as I was used to while I was studying in India, or I was living in India before I moved to Sweden. I think Sweden offers you a very sanitized meaning of the word queer. It's quite different from the international context. It is a country which is welfare state, obviously, and sort of has these progressive laws. But what I very quickly realized after jumping into that society was how these laws actually just sanitize the political meanings of everything. And now we've given you laws, and now all of you just shut up and like live like cis people, and follow the heteronormative norm, just jump into it. So that's the context with which I picked up this research, and yeah, I had a lot of fun doing it.
Hi, I will go now. Just to piggyback off of everybody, thank you, Lisa, for doing this panel. Thank you for asking me. I'm so honored to be on this call with everybody, especially as a student. But yeah, I think how I approach the subject of queer art will also give kind of my background, if that's okay. Because I don't know how to answer it without giving some of my background. But for me, art has always been political. I grew up in a household with my father was as left-leaning as you could be, and my mother was as right-leaning as you could be. And so politics was always something that my mom avoided politics, my father always wanted to talk about it. And so him and I would have conversations about it, and I very early on knew that I wanted to study politics because I was so fascinated with how much tension it created growing up and just seeing that in my parents' relationship. And I think intertwining with that is since I was a little kid, like since I could walk, I've been doing art in some way or another, whether that was like making little films or painting or doing like dance and doing theater and doing creative writing and all of these different various art forms, whatever I could get my hands on, whatever I did, I was doing. And while I was doing that, my interest in politics was also seeping into those forms. And then while I was growing up, I also was realizing that I was queer and that I was attracted to women. And so it kind of all intertwined together. And so when I think about the subject of queer art, I also think about the struggles of embracing my queer identity and actually feeling like a real artist as I've developed and as I've grown up. And so I approach it from the perspective that queer identity is unfortunately inherently political, and it's only increasingly becoming political, and therefore queer art is political. I unfortunately cannot, because I'm a politics and studio art double major, for me, art always has political meaning. And so I think like the disinformation that I study, I see it in art and kind of the misperceptions of people in the community and just not even the queer community, but we talk about intersectionality, various other identities. And so I am constantly hoping to reform it in some way with my queer artistry.
Right, that's really interesting, sort of some of your personal experiences, Alex. I'm just thinking about that, but just the way that you started off talking about, art as political, right? And then queer art as political, and it reminded me, and I actually had pulled this out too, and in Shuddhash's introduction to his article, he talks kind of about this as a quote from the Malmö Queer Festival, film festival. So I'm going to just read part of it because I think it just resonates, and I'd like to sort of dig further into this idea of, what is queer art and why does it matter, right? Why is it important to talk about it? So Shuddhash's quote that he has, the queer body is political. It does not fit into the norm boxes society provides. It is too big, too black, too hairy, too soft, too pale, too slim, and too muscular. It refuses to testify for one or the other sex. It is not distinct enough. Our bodies are political. By existing and being visible, we bear witness to the norms that affect everyone, queer or not. These norms can lead to self-hatred and to hate from others. Hate against us because we do not force our bodies to fit into these norms. Hatred that can lead to harassment, discrimination, violence, and murder. Hate that causes LGBTQ plus people to feel worse and have less access to resources. The queer body is political activism. We are celebrating the queer body through films, discussion, and performances at MQF. So I feel like in some ways that touches on a lot of what you were both sort of talking about, or all three of you were talking about in terms of just the political nature of being of queerness and of art. And I'd love for you to sort of expand on that a bit more. Why is it important to talk about these things?
I can go if it was okay with that. Yeah, so I think just like starting with a little anecdote, when Kylie and me were co-curating Found Family and co-founding the Queer Arts database, I ended up having a conversation with someone on a different political spectrum than me, and they didn't really understand the queer community. And when I was telling them about me and Kylie's like work and our project, they asked me and this is, I mean, an understandable question for somebody who isn't part of the community, I think, but they asked me like, why does it have to be queer art? Why does it have to be a solely queer show? Why can't it just be art? And kind of didn't understand why we were narrowing it down to a specific community. And so that, is when I started talking about representation, and how important and necessary it is to have a space where people feel safe and people feel represented and people feel heard. And it has I am so proud of all the work we did, but it is even more like necessary right now. And there's a political necessity with queer art as well. But it's important to be having these conversations, especially while the queer community is in danger and is that threat right now. But yeah, I think it's difficult to have, like, I'm so glad that we did a specifically queer show and we specifically highlighted that community. And even like that was such an intersectional show where we had various identities represented and people represented and regions represented. So yeah, I hope that answered it.
I can add a little bit to my thoughts. I think Alex beautifully summed that up. But art, the visual arts, performing arts, arts broadly, these are forms of expression, and so there is this communicative function and potential of these works. They are, they're narrative producers, and so when we think in that light, art as any form of communication should spark discourse. And what is my hope is it sparks activism. And so I talked a little bit about this in my article. But I really see a gallery or museum space, and it could even actually be a public space. It should function as that forum. So we're always, my goal is to make sure that whatever space I'm in, whether it be the academy, a museum space, a gallery, is that we are continually decolonizing that space. And so what we're doing is not only disrupting kind of the paradigms and structures of power by including diverse forces, but that we're amplifying them. So it can't just come with inclusion, right? You have to do more than that. And so that's what Found Family allowed us to do in a, Southern formerly Baptist university, is to create something that was unprecedented and use that as a space. And, again, not coincidentally, this exhibition coincided with a very tumultuous presidential election in the United States. And so thinking about in a red state such as South Carolina, to make sure that we are giving space for us as the queer community, but also realizing, I think, the power of art to do that, and how it, like I said, can connect one another, to offer not just diverse perspectives, but also, I think, at the core, remind us of everybody's humanity, even those that we don't agree with, whether that be their ideas or their ways of life or modes of being. What we share, at our core, is that we are human. And so we get in trouble when we begin to dehumanize people who are different from us. And so this was our way to try to bring that humanity back into a space where these conversations aren't always freely talked about, expressed, or acknowledged.
Yeah, so from sort of to kind of build up a little bit on what Alex and Kylie said, I think the situation is probably slightly different. The way sort of this, I think the significance of queer is that, first of all, like in my work, what I see is that in context to your geographical location, as to what city you're based in and what part of a city you're based in, and what century it is, queer tends to mean like sort of, different things. But I think it's significant because what it means, and also very importantly, what it does not mean, kind of determines very much, particularly in context of a queer film festival, that what you can do at the queer film festival and what you cannot do at the queer film festival, right? So in that sense, the festival itself has a lot of gatekeeping function, both from the perspective of what defines or what can be construed as queer cinema and what are the limits of when it becomes queer cinema, and what is not queer cinema, number one, and also sort of, determining what are queer practices for the community and which are not. So I think it has like sort of the curation part of it has a very, very strong, significant performative role to kind of articulate the meanings of what it means to be queer and what it does not. So just to give you an example, like for example, at the Stockholm Queer Film Festival, that is not really covered in the article so much, like what you really see is like what I could interpret queer meaning is that you're rebellious, but not too rebellious, right? Like you are going to embrace the values of activism, but there is nothing really to fight against as such when you're living in Stockholm. It's not like somebody is like kind of shutting down your access to health, or somebody's going to kind of make, like make your life very difficult as it may be in countries of South Asia or in southern parts of the US. So you want to stir up the pot, but you really don't have so much to stir up, right? Like because there is no real force to fight against and so on. So then it means something completely different. But then you get another bunch of people like the ones that I've mentioned in the article with Malmo, and then it starts meaning something else altogether. And that's where the quote that you read out come in, where they really want it to be about body politics. They're finding ways to kind of, finding significance of using queer cinema to really articulate the different standards that the society is unable to accept. And it's just like one standard, one kind of a body type, and everything is in that sense very homogeneous, and to fight that in society as well. So I think that's my response to this one. Yeah.
If I can jump in there too.
Yeah.
So I'm so happy that, the fact that there are places, cities like Stockholm, Sweden, where it sounds like to be queer does not necessarily have to be a radical phenomenon. And I'll be clear, I mean, to live out your humanity, your personhood to its fullest potential is not a radical concept. But when you are in certain political situations, of course, it has been transformed, and the rhetoric has been used in such a way to transform that into a radical idea. So I feel very strongly that actually in the US South, for example, to be queer is to be radical, and wear that as a badge of honor and think that's what we need to do, because what we're continuing to do is disrupt and resist. And so that in turn, I guess, just makes it radical. But I'm saying this all to not apologize for using that term, and also for acting in those ways.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
it's interesting.
Oh, sorry. You go.
Well, I mean, just thinking about the different contexts, right? I mean, Shuddhashar was saying, is talking about, Sweden, where it is so different to be queer, right? And all the I mean, it's been decades since they've made a lot of these things legal, right? We're now in the US really struggling with. And so, in fact, things are going backwards, especially with trans rights and identity. So the contexts are so different. And even more so in places like in the South, right? And in certain states in the South, where even to discuss queer in K through 12 schools is not permitted unless you're talking about in terms of disease, right? So, which talk about stigmatizing and all those other things, but then you can't help but if you are queer and want to identify as such, it's nothing but political.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, just to quickly add to a little bit to that context, my research ends till 2021, after which the right wing has come in. So there has been a little bit of backtracking particularly on trans issues, a little bit of backtracking. I mean, there was this program where a drag queen would, or a drag artist would sit in a library and read a story book to little kids. And that's been like sort of actively pushed back. There is an active pushback by the right wing to not allow for something like that to happen. And another interesting logic is that the right wing actually uses the LGBTQ, the success of the LGBTQ struggle as a valid reason against immigration, which is like sort of this huge point saying that, oh, these immigrants are going to come in from outside and they're not going to accept our queer culture, right? So that's why they should be thrown out. So there is like, so yeah, it's not all hunky-dory. It's a little bit of a tussle. And I think the tussle is also sort of dissolving it. I know I noticed that Alex used the word community, you know, a little while back. And what you really see that what has happened over the years is there is no community, you know, like sort of, so you have the meetings for the gay people that happen separately, and a lesbian club that happens separately, and the trans people that hang out separately. The only time of the year that they come together is the Pride, and that's it, you know. And then there is the Queer Film Festival, where you know, like, it is going to be a certain kind of a crowd that is going to come in. You know, when you have a trans film, you're going to see the trans audiences, but you're not going to see like sort of, you know, the gay men in their 60s walk in and watch a trans film. It's very difficult and it's not going to happen. So I think that there is a significance as an, at least as an outsider, because I'm not sort of a part, I've not grown up in the Swedish community. So at least as an outsider, I see that there is a lack of a radical edge, you know, and I think that's important. I think that's important to preserve and conserve, particularly right now where all these immigration debates, all the right-wing debates are coming in, you know. So you have all these rights and it all looks very nice for the last 20, 30 years, but it might just disappear, and one has to be very careful of that. Yeah, that was my piece.
I wonder if that sense of being marginalized or having, you know, being under threat, how does that contribute to sense of community, right? So it may be in the process, those identities that, or sub-identities, whatever you want to call it, you know, get erased, they're less important, right? And so then people come together despite their differences to fight for rights that they would all agree that they all deserve. So certainly not there in the US, although I know that a lot of communities nonetheless do sort of fragment into subgroups in their, you know, everyday lives and others, you know, events and such.
Yeah, I think I'll say something in response to that. One thing that has been really big for me lately has been community, and has been like the people around me. And I think like it's ironic because in the past few months, I have never felt more supported as a queer person than I do right now, which is ironic because of how much legislation is in this like state committees right now, and is the executive orders that are coming out of the White House, and all of this political legislation that is actively trying to erase my identity and erase my best friend's transgender identity, and like all this legislation. And I've never felt more supported because of my community and because of my people. And just kind of, I feel like because of, like you said, the threat of the marginalized community, I feel like has brought us together in a way that we weren't together before, even at Furman. Honestly, I feel like Furman has, for the most part, rallied together, and we've had conversations, and like we're having dialogue like this before these past few months. I haven't had dialogue like this, and I haven't been able to openly discuss my role as a queer person. And so yeah, I think community is so important to engage even across differences and to engage across intersectionality.
Yeah, Shuddhashar, one of the things that you talk about also is community and sort of how the film festivals pull together a sense of community. And I'm wondering how does that fit also up and against the gatekeeping that you described? Like, community for whom?
Yeah, I mean, so like in that sense, my analytical argument is really that the Queer Film Festival really doesn't necessarily celebrate queerness. It actually teaches people how to be queer. You know, and that's sort of been my takeaway from the research. The interesting thing about my work has been, like, you know, it towards the end, when I was like sort of finishing up the book, it was really COVID time, right? And suddenly the festivals had shut down and so on. So, and then you see this amazing thing where you have like sort of the big opera houses, and you have the theater and everything that gets state funding. You have the big festivals, everything is shut down and nothing is running. But these little festivals are running, you know. And that's how you kind of see this evidence of the fact that these festivals have been able to create something for themselves in the past 10 years that they have been running, or 15 years that they have been running, that it's of value to the people who attend them, right? Like, and that's how I see that community actually taking shape. So just like sort of a fun fact, we have a friend here in Germany, and they did a research at the University of Potsdam, the Film University in Potsdam. They did a research a few years ago trying to see how long does a queer film festival last, you know, and you really kind of see, and they have done a global mapping of these trends. I can share these links at the end, but they have done this global mapping of these trends saying that queer film festivals seldom last more than 10 years, you know, particularly in Europe. You start a queer film festival, it's going to go great for about 10 years and then it's going to shut down. The exception that you see with the Malmö Festival and the Stockholm Festival, and their study was like all across Europe. So the exception that you see with the Swedish festivals is that they actually start pretty late, because most cities, most, you know, urban regions of Europe had queer film festivals that started in the 80s and the 90s. But with Sweden, you really see the first festival starting in sometime around 2005 and 6 that lasted for a couple of years, and then it shut down. And then you had the Malmö and the Stockholm Film Festival start together. And while I was doing my research around 2016-17, these festivals were 10 years old. And now they're going strong, you know. Every year they have new audiences. Every year they have new volunteers come in and work for them. And I think that's what gives you this sort of, you know, positive sense of community, that yes, there are people who are coming together, who are pulling together. They have no reason to, really, if you think about it, to be able to do that, you know. Like, if they have problems, there are state recourses that they can go to and address their issues. But there is something that is going on, perhaps that could be described as precarity, a sense of loneliness, a sense of, you know, neglect, or the fact that nobody cares about their specific identity and they're just sort of, you know, counted as one of the herd or whatever. But these festivals are successful, and I think that's how they're forging these communities. And I think they have a lot of potential, which you saw in COVID, that these festivals were back and they were, you know, they shut down, like, but as soon as things opened up, and I don't know if you remember, Sweden was this exceptional country which didn't have the lockdowns, right? So we never experienced a lockdown state. So as soon as, so, but we had like sort of restrictions on gathering. So, okay, so what if, you know, we've got a cinema that seats 100 people, we can only see 20 people, we'll show the film 3 times, you know, in a row, and get 20 each in each screening. So, and that was entirely driven by sort of this group of people who want to pull together to let this run, because they find that it's important for them. Yeah.
Yeah, we were all watching Sweden with quite a lot of interest to see how the outcomes will be with COVID, given that, but you know, to be fair, also, I think, you know, in the Nordic countries in general, there's plenty of social distancing that just happens naturally. So
We had this running joke in Sweden now that the COVID is over, let's get done with the 3-meter distance and go back to the old 5-meter one.
yes. Yes, exactly. Exactly. Same thing in Norway too. Yeah, good. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about sort of intersectionality and how that plays, especially since we've been talking about community and Alex, I'm really glad that you felt a sense of community here in at Furman and probably elsewhere as well. But how does intersectionality sort of add another layer to the work that you do, but also just ideas of queerness?
Yeah, as human beings, we like to categorize things and people. And while sometimes that can be a useful structure in some ways, of course, it has its limits. And we have to, I think, with any sort of social identity group, really, really be careful of kind of reducing that to a kind of monolithic experience and identity. And so, we have to do the same thing with queer identity and recognize that your entire personhood involves not only your sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, but your race, ethnicity, how your body functions, your age, where you're coming from, all of that. And so the one thing that I really loved about Found Family, the exhibition that Alex and I curated, was that actually naturally intersectionality really came out, I want to say, in the majority of the works that we ended up choosing. And so that was something, I think that we individually kind of hoped, but weren't sure how much we had to pull that out. And so it's great to see BIPOC artists who also identify as queer, those that maybe don't have citizenship status in the US in the same way, right, as other artists, and to have this dialogue and know that just as we've been talking about political climate, but geography changes your relationship to this term and identity category as queer. And that came out in the exhibition. And so it's always important that we remind ourselves that, human beings have multifaceted identities, and we get into trouble when we begin to think about that in a really reductive and limited way. And so intersectionality, I think, is something that we have to continue to insert and implore and make sure that people are considering. And I'm, proud to say that at Furman University, we have conversations in which, I love it when my students, just like Alex did, brought up intersectionality, and they may not always know where that term arrives or have done all the theoretical reading about it, but it's in their kind of colloquial discourse now. And to think about, we exist as these, like I said, these multifaceted, really rich and versatile people. And we can't lose sight of that. And so the queer community is exactly like that, just like any community should be, is that we can't reduce us to a single idea, or just think about how we choose to identify in terms of gender or sexual orientation, or even, I will say, with our relationship with other sorts of institutions like the church. That was something that came out that we wanted in the exhibition, that we wanted to make sure that we could acknowledge that the queer community in particular may have had let's say, difficult relationships, sometimes traumatic relationships with this, with the religious institutions. I'm thinking particularly about the Christian church, but of course that could be extrapolated to talk about all different types of organized religion. But that not everybody, right, who is part of the queer community has that same sort of struggle or conflict. And so we don't want to, stereotype that. That becomes dangerous.
Yeah, I'll say something in react because I was gonna say a very similar thing to you. It will not sound as eloquent as Kylie did, but yeah, I think though I have such a intense passion for it, I mean, we are limited by politics constantly. It forces us, or even subconsciously, we put ourselves into boxes and biases and stereotypes and echo chambers where we are constantly being fueled by the same voices and same news sources and just the same perspectives. And I think often identity politics limits us rather than lets us actually embrace our identities, similar to what Kylie said. And I think, like myself, I'm a queer neurodivergent had religious trauma, like Kylie mentioned, from the church when I came out. And I do identify as a woman, but I kind of sit on the edge of the gender binary and often feeling empowered as a woman, but sometimes not, and sometimes not understanding my identity. And all of these identities are important when I'm discussing my queerness and my experience as being queer. I mean, what I faced in the church, really shaped who I became, and shaped a lot of my perspectives on religion. And, I deal with all of that and all of those different identities and various experiences that come together in such a multifaceted way. But I also have friends who are queer and are immigrants, and they are so worried about policies and legislation right now and just being able to exist and their safety as a person, that they can't even feel like they embrace their queer identity or can exist as a queer person because they're so worried about feeling secure and just existing. And so I think my kind of whole summary of this, thinking about intersectionality, is I hope there does come a time where we can embrace all of our various identities rather than feeling restricted by them or feeling like they're boxes that we fit into. I feel like I have conversations sometimes with people where they feel like queer means a certain thing, or they have certain expectations that they have to fit, or if Kylie, I feel like you and me have had conversations about your various identities and what you feel like you are not upholding or whatever. Sorry to call you out, but I feel like we've had conversations about that and kind of your anxieties about that. But I hope there comes a time where we can embrace them, and we can embrace identity politics, because I think we're living in a time where it's such a harsh word. But yeah.
Yeah. I hear that, and I think that it's really up to curators such as Kylie, Alex, in the Queer Film Festival, people like Jay, who at the Malmo Festival, who take up the concept of intersectionality and really sort of, put the radical edge back, or the political thing that kind of back into the queer. So at least in the Swedish context, I think that was one way to actually revive the thing that, okay, well, you're queer, but you're queer for what, or queer for who, and how is your sort of identity politics going to grow beyond it? And I think that you can always kind of take as a curator, I've seen these curators, the film curators, take a lot of brickbats for it, because it often pushes the limits of what defines the community. And are you actually, so when you kind of define a festival around, for example, queerness and questions of access, is this a festival about disability, or is this about queerness, and to what limits can you push it? And then you have sort of, at least at a festival, you have this audience that expects certain things when they come to the festival, but then they realize they're not getting those certain things, right? And then you get a bit of a pushback. So I think it's also to the strength of curators to actually hold their own, and again, inform the community about, or inform their audiences, inform the people who are coming, and how intersectionality is important. You can't just be stuck in your own sort of echo chamber in that sense. But also sort of, in my analysis, I saw that at least as a film festival program, which kind of very often there is a large number of people who get involved in, at least 5, 7, 10 people who get involved in doing this. And the more you open it, the more people who come in. It's interesting because it sort of has this double-edged sword of intersectionality falling into the notion of political correctness, right? So then suddenly when you're working in a group, you're very anxious about articulating your own position, because you're always scared that somebody might be worse off than you, and then you're going to step on their toes, right? So that creates its own politics of, trying to be politically correct in the process of being inclusive, and then things go really crazy, you know. So and there's an interesting passage in my book that I write about, you know, how difficult putting together a meal for a meeting can then suddenly become, right? Because like you say, we're going to all have, and everybody's going to bring like a little bit of potluck, and then you realize, okay, most people are vegetarian, so the vegetarians feel like that, and then, you know, and then you suddenly have this chain of email of about 26 emails which are discussing which vegan chips are acceptable and which are not, and then you realize, you know, this is bringing in organizational inefficiencies, which means the festival is not going to work. So your end goal is going to not be achieved, and so on. So I think that it's a double-edged sword, but yeah, shout out to Kylie and Alex for, you know, doing the intersectional curation. But because I've seen how brave you have to be able to do it. Yeah.
I'm loving that image of the, the potluck. But but it does speak a lot to the challenges of this, and what are the ways forward, and especially in trying to navigate. I mean, you know, there's so much concern, and I think legitimate concern about seeing anything as monolithic, right? And it even goes back to, you know, Alex's earliest statement about, you know, why queer art, you know, why not just art, you know? But then, you know, if queer art, then which kind of queer, and who gets to define queer, and, you know, and who are we leaving out in our understanding of queer, and how do the curator decides that, what kind of power and role does a curator have in determining, you know, what that means, and what the intention is. So tons of, you know, more sort of things to think about, but what are the ways forward, would you say, for challenging or moving the conversation about these identities into a healthier place? That's the right way. Right way to say it.
So I'll try to be brief in my answer to this question, and hopefully others will jump in. I think one is we have to be, whether you're a curator of whatever sort of space you're thinking about, or you're an author, or you're just a public speaker, I think we have to be really assured in our positionality, and be willing to be upfront about that, because we will make mistakes. As we said, you know, like Siddharth, I liked how you expressed, like, what's the line between accepting or embracing intersectionality and then having to be careful of political correctness. And I think that's a real fine line to straddle, because we don't want to offend, piss anybody off, right? But at the same time, though, we also have to be authentic and real too. And so that will change, I think, with, you know, who's in your space and what you're doing. But I think, as, you know, when I think of myself as both, you know, a professor, a teacher, an educator, a curator, as a person, I always, you know, I'm upfront that, okay, I'm producing selective narratives, right? So curating is thinking about to care for, right, or to care about, but what is that? I have to define what that is. And so you can't please everybody all the time, right? But what you can do is you can say, in this time and space, I am choosing to do this because maybe these are the most vulnerable people that I am caring for, the community that I'm caring for. And I guess that's my response to that. I think it's just being really upfront and honest, which is not an easy thing, and you're going to get pushback and judgment. But I think also that's what allows us, I'm going to sound really, really cheeseball here for a moment, but allows us as a global community, I think, to reach and to grow, and to continually, I don't know, just give everybody the dignity that they deserve, if they're good people. I'll put that qualification on that.
I mean, I think the way forward, first thing from a European perspective that you think of, and I don't know how it sounds to an American audience as well, is state support, you know, sort of revival of state support, more state support. There is a little bit, you know, you sort of cutting it down over a period of time, but you sort of bring it back. I think it's important because the statistics show which sort of particular groups are at the moment voting right wing and which are not. At the moment I'm in Germany, where the right wing is very, very nasty. People like Trump sound conservative, at best, on how bad things within the discourse of the day, which is the local right wing sort of Nazi upshoot party is. So I think that it's the way forward would be state support, and the way forward has to be education in school, like sort of bring in at a very early level sensitivity about sexual identity in school curriculums and so on, and sort of that process has been going on in Sweden for a while, but sort of to reinforce that process, to ensure that if there are vested interests trying to create roadblocks in that sort of historical process, to make sure to remove them. I think that's kind of important. Yeah.
My turn. Yeah, so I think I mean I'll just go ahead and say like I am so fueled with anger right now. I'm so angry. I'm like I'm angry at politics, and I'm angry at America, and I am angry at all my friends that didn't vote, and angry at the people that I know that voted for Trump. And I'm just so frustrated and so emotional all of the time. And because I'm a politics major, I can't escape it. And I don't necessarily want to escape it because it's what I'm passionate about. I want to make a change in the world. I want to be constantly doing work like Found Family. If I could recreate Found Family a million times, I would. Um, because the feedback that we got from that and the space that we made was so special and so unique. And we made so many people feel seen. And I think for me, Found Family was the first time I had actually curated something. It was the first time I had ever worked on anything like and anything like that. And working with Kylie changed my life, and it made me want to invest in a future like that of curating. And for me, I found that curation is education and it's representation. And that's prominently the two things that it is for me. And at the end of the day, we as curators and we as artists are educators. And, we don't always have to be educating people. This is one thing where, like, I feel being queer, I have to educate people sometimes on what that means. And it doesn't mean we always have to be educating people with our work, but we should, in my mind, be trying to influence knowledge and influence people who don't care or disagree, and just giving them the right information or giving them an experience with a film or with a series of artworks, or like with my documentary project that I'm working on right now. My whole documentary project is on the queer community, and I'm like, my goal with it is to invest joy into it, but also get people to see the queer community for something that is not just the queer community, and getting to see them as people and see their stories and hear their stories and understand that the legislation that's happening right now and who Trump is as a human being is so harmful to these people. And I think it's our responsibility as artists and our responsibility as curators to shape the future and to give back and to, try and make a change, as cliche as that sounds, as cliche as it sounds, and as silly as I feel saying it, I do want to make a change. And I do want to be constantly putting art into the world that means something and that has some kind of symbolic intention. But yeah.
So I don't think that is, I mean, yes, cliche, but that is what we need. And so I'm so grateful that Alex, that you're here, you're with us, and that you're doing all this good work. And I will just say that to kind of reiterate, I mean, curators are storytellers. And so with that comes a profound, profound privilege to share somebody's story, but also a huge responsibility, right? Because that power, depending on how you choose to harness it, could do a lot of good or a lot of harm. And so I think that's important for us to keep in mind, and also, to continue to resist to also those, either sometimes they're dominant narrative, sometimes they're really, held by a marginalized group, that loud minority. But to continue, I think, to showcase our lives and continue to move forward, because we're still, the legislation unfortunately is not going to go away, at least anytime soon. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to stop living and we don't have to stop thriving, or but with that comes resistance. So I think it's continually challenging and trying to find ways to turn that anger, that rage, whatever it is, into action. And that's the hardest part, right? But we need spaces. If we don't have control over our K through 12 public curriculum, as we were talking about, then we need to find alternative, or I should say different spaces to do that. And maybe that's where other sort of cultural institutions, whether it be museums, gallery spaces, or honestly the public streets, where we need to do that. Because we are in a dangerous position where we can't openly talk about, at least I should just say openly talk about a lot of about our identities. So we don't have the privilege, at least right now, in the state of South Carolina and most parts of the country, to do that. So we need to find then other methods of doing that. And that's why curating in whatever space it is becomes so critical and pivotal to doing that.
Yeah, and just adding on another thing that I forgot to say, I think people undermine the power of a representational space. And I didn't even understand the power in having a space that was for you and for a specific community. I didn't fully understand it until we did Found Family, and seeing the feedback and seeing how many people were crying and seeing how many people were just in the gallery crying, how many people came up to Kylie and me and thanked us. I didn't realize the power of that and the power of just feeling represented. So I think continuing to do things like having a queer film festival and making queer art and challenging these stereotypes is so important.
It was a fantastic exhibition for sure. I went and it was jammed full of people. So you all did a great job. Alex, I'm aware that you need to run off to class.
It's okay. We like have kind of a late policy. So if we are not done with this, I can be a few minutes.
Okay.
Thanks.
Shuddhashar, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just to jump into that, I think that also I see sort of this tendency within academia to ghetto queer theory as like something that's just limited to sexuality and it's for queer people. And I think that as a political theorist or a political philosopher, I think it's also important for me to bring it out of that ghetto, right? Like sort of queer theory really has the potential to inform us about political ideas which extend beyond only sexual preferences. It has a much larger potential, and I think that that in terms of talking about the future or the purpose of this work, both in terms of academic work as well as the artistic work, really has the potential to reach out to a broader audience, to kind of see how we see the world and find ways to understand it. And I think it fits well into that bracket as well. Yeah.
If I can just add one thing to that, I love that. So, I introduced myself by saying that I'm an art historian that, deals with these topics, but also in terms of more of my work recently has been grappling with this kind of methodological framework of queering something. And Carl Whittington, who's a queer art historian, a medievalist at Ohio State, talks about how we have to do our best to divorce this notion of what it is to be queer with sexuality. Not to say that because we should ignore that part, but what I love is the implicit ambiguity in the term queer, even, and something that like I really embrace in the idea of fluidity and like moving between these boundaries. And so that's what I think even this process of to queer anything allows us. So thinking about something that anything that goes against, again, the norm or the normative, which you'll have to define, but it's something that's disruptive, which is so awesome and so great, and something we should continue to brace and uplift. Like, why not always challenge that status quo?
Right, and that's such a great point, and that you're all bringing forward. You know, is queerness and queering, right? You know, it's not confined to identity, right? It is also looking at the world with its complexity and appreciating that complexity and celebrating it, and disrupting what are the received categories, you know. And so it's I think our societies in general love categories and love to put people in boxes, and we know nobody fits neatly into any box, right? And so ultimately, you know, we think about queer theory, it is about disrupting that whole process and that whole, you know, and who gets to define who is put into which box. So I think that's a good way to sort of think about I don't know, the future project of all of this too, right? Is that we keep on pushing against these structures that try to confine and control and limit the humanity of each of us. Well, good. Then I think what we should do is wrap up. And I will just say again that I really, really appreciate this conversation. I know we could go on for another couple hours, but we all have other responsibilities as well, including Alex's class. But thank you very much for taking this time to meet and to talk and to share your ideas and your insights from the various projects that you've been working on. Appreciate also hearing your senses of community and that importance, and it certainly is it is important to remember community, especially when times get challenging, right? Whether it's here in South Carolina in the US or in Germany, as you know, you all grapple with other things. And in Sweden, even though they have some rights, there's also still challenges, right? So great. Well, thank you so much. And for everybody who is visiting and will be visiting this, don't forget to go to our issue that's on Curated. You can read the articles by Kylie and Shuddhashar there, and also the other articles that have to do with curation. So thank you very much and take care.